So then, we are back with a more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste from many centuries. As we read then from Yeshayahu the prophet, let's then understand a few sections related then with the time of the Messiah and also the work he did. Obviously he completed the spring feast found in Leviticus the 23rd chapter, and during his time of service he was not interested regarding the people being converted into a philosophy of his own. But let's then understand the holy instructions as it serves as a map from starting until the end regarding the times and the seasons. And when we understand it from these bases, then during the time of the Messiah we understand how the people, they could not grasp and truly absorb the instructions as per the prophets and the Holy Torah. The Messiah himself, as he was completing the spring feast, he had to face a very big problem. Firstly then, the holy instructions were twisted. There were lots of maasim and takanot, and these were hindering the people from hearing the truth of the holy instructions. They were kept blind. And these what was then a huge problem during the time when the Messiah then was explaining the holy instructions. However, when he was able then to clean it up during his time of service, and when he came from the dead, he spent a year with his people, teaching them, showing them, as then the holy instructions were designed and given to Moses. Later on then the Messiah was explaining step by step how they should perform. And then when the Messiah was gone, then was the time for his people then to put to practice what they learned and trained during the year he stayed with them. So let's then make a quick understanding of how was then the trade on the land during this time. Prior of the Messiah dying on a stick, trade was very scarce. Let's understand a factor. Israel was in crisis when the Messiah was around. As the economical crisis is then taking place in our time, so it was during the time of the Messiah. Trade was not doing very nicely during those times. Not for Israel. But let's understand the Roman Empire at the time, they were expanding themselves, but the economy of Israel, as it was then designed by Moses himself, it was very scant. As the Messiah then came from the dead, he reorganized the entire system, not only the instructions but also the layers related with Ishmael. The Messiah did explain the anointing also of the first son. Mostly was disregarded because they were not involved with the services of the Holy Temple. As we can read, for instance, from the prophecies of Daniel and Yeshayahu related with the Gentiles, sometimes the words used in Hebrew as they were translated over the centuries, they were not given as much focus as when the Messiah was speaking of tabernacling. Because of these, then generated wordings and events that we must today filter them. However, we can do these via the layers that should be then properly placed, so then the events and the flow of events can make sense. For instance, a few words regarding Kingdom of the North and South are not the same a nation or a group of people going southbound or northbound. They are very distinct, because if you switch either of these, then when you read does not match with other layers from other prophets. So we can't go only by words, but have to go by then the layers thereof. So when the Messiah then was completing the spring feast, he said that every word then must be completed. He was not speaking of words. He was speaking of layers. That's why then the instructions during his time was extremely contaminated. And at the time he was completing the spring feast, he couldn't, by any way of imagination, teaching them the layers from time to time. People were barely hanging on to their dear lives because the situation in Israel was very precarious. They were charging temple tax. They were charging to people to go into the city, and then every time a person was going out to do trade and to do what they had to do, when they returned they had to pay taxes. It was highly taxed to those people during the time of the Messiah. That's why when the Messiah was explaining layers of understanding of the prophets, he had to sometimes come up with a proverbs, or then understandings of his own teachings related with money, because that's what they were thinking of, only money, because they would go out of the city. If they would return, they had to pay taxes. So they were always involved with some sort of money at some way, and the Messiah ended up saying many of his parables related with money. And because of these, when the Messiah then died on the stake and he came back, then there was a time where he had then the forward motion of teaching the people tabernacling and also trade the way it was designed. And there was a tremendous wealth on the land, prosperity of every kind you can ever dream of. And as the Messiah then was explaining those holy instructions, then the land was then prosperous, until shortly after his ascension, when he gathered then his people and then he laid it down the way it should be, because then was a time for him to show them what vengeance, or the autumn feast then coming very shortly, should be. And let me say this to you, people they didn't like it, because they were going through a prosperity on the land untold. If you think during the time of Shilimon was prosperous, you would not have any idea how prosperous the land was during the time of the Messiah. We don't have very many records of this time, because the whole purpose of the known world's translation of the ancient documents of the Holy Hebrews, they only have the focus on the completion of the spring feast. And we don't have very many records of the time he spent a year with his people. And we know why. Because the Messiah was saying that this prosperity they experienced for a time of a year, and then organizing, making deals with other nations, and then understanding the Roman Empire, what was going on and where they are heading towards, then they want to maintain the prosperity. And the Messiah said, if you do this without tabernacling then your soul is lost. And they didn't understand this. And they made a decision to maintain what they wanted, and they disregarded the Messiah. So then, this time, where we are observing the world changing very rapidly, what are the few sections we should be concerned with? Trade, it's a must. But how do we relate prior of starting this unprecedented time of wealth? We are shortly, some roughly couple of years, some 20 to 24 months before this unprecedented time of wealth. How should we handle this? As the Messiah was explaining areas related with the spring feast while he was doing his duty and completing the spring feast of Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the Messiah knew what was coming, but he couldn't talk at the time. That's why then when we read, for instance, then the disciples came to him and asked, is God then going to restore Israel as it was before? And the Messiah said, it's not for you to know the times and the season at this point. Was then the Messiah withholding information from them? Later on, when he came back from the dead, then was the time for them to know everything. Every aspect of the holy instructions related with the Torah, the prophets, the writings, and the whole works, he explained them. As a result, as they were obedient, prosperity was byproduct. So as we are experiencing during this time of the restoration period, what can we say of the spring feast? The spring feast was a restoring time. It was a restoration of the holy instructions, the Torah, the prophets, and what they said, and the prophecies. And the Messiah was reorganizing them. When he came back from the dead, then prosperity came. As we are then, very similarly, during the time of the Messiah completing the spring feast, so we find the holy instructions being then cleaned up. You find the organization of the prophecies. You find the layers being properly set. You find people being more interested in the holy language. And as we understand from the time of the Messiah, and from the time of Shaliach Shaul, Shaliach Shimon, Shaliach Yohanan, they went to Asia, except the Messiah, obviously. And that's why Asia is so prosperous. Because as they were then prosperous during the time of Shaliach Shaul, so they maintained those characteristics of how to do trade responsibly. For instance, many nations of Asia, they do their government works via then transactions. When you have transactions, you have a detailed and precise way of closing deals. No person is then led to steal. So popular on the West. Governments, they simply steal. They use the money printing machine to steal. But when you have involvement of transactions, then you have to be responsible. And this truly is what's coming towards us. We have an unprecedented time of prosperity beyond imagination. However, what is the problem? The problem is people are making a choice of the pleasures and prosperities of this world over tabernacling. And the Messiah said very precisely back then, if the choice is then prosperity, a person then has a soul lost at the end. Let's then understand a few sections related then with what China is doing. China has done it again. China had visited the Soviet Union and then Italy and also Germany. The European Union is then direct linked with China. China leads, liking it or not. The European Union is in the hands of the Chinese. They already linked themselves with China, and China has already explained the Silk Road, ancient roots of ancient times being restored, and China is unifying then a larger piece of the globe, and the Silk Road does not include the West. Understandably, as we read then these understandings, then you find the region of China very importantly placed on the map, and then the ancient routes being shown. It is a very long path. It takes a great portion of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and the Northern Kingdom, obviously. But not only this, reading from the article, very importantly placed on the BRICS post, it's explained. For instance, a piece of the article. The new map shows the Chinese plans for the Silk Road run through central China to the northern Xinjiang, from where it travels through Central Asia, entering Kazakhstan and onto Iraq, Iran, Syria, and then Istanbul in Turkey, where it runs on the other side of Europe and going over there, and on the other side in Germany, Netherlands, and Italy. The maritime Silk Road begins in China, Fujian, and ends at Venice, Italy. So this is a huge plan of China, and it is underway and must become prosperous. So as we are during this very precise moment in time where the instructions are being cleaned, when the Chinese system becomes available on the net, then time of prosperity you can ever dreamed of. But then the Messiah said very precisely, what is it for you, even if you gain the entire world, even if you are in charge of the entire world's wealth, yet at the end your soul then is lost. So the Messiah was saying words that were very important. So then, why is it the West not included? What was the work of Satan during the time of this period? He obviously was very upset because the entire East was very prosperous and he wanted to have a time of his own. So he went out of the area of Asia and he instituted his own. The East was in the side of the teachings of the Messiah, and the West was in the side of the teachings of Satan. That's why you have East and West. The West was fine for a time because of wars, destruction. And during this time you find then the East once again prospering themselves beyond imagination, and the West was left out of the plan. It's true that there are, for example, plans of starting up then Dragon Mart in Cancun, Mexico, and linking up with the system. But the West is trying at any cost to get a hold of and control then the Middle East and the other countries. But it's not going to work. Because of these, let's then understand some of the very ancient words of the Creator himself when he spoke with Yeshayahu the prophet. There is a section related with, then explains Egypt. And out of Egypt to Syria, and came, and Syria into Egypt, and Egypt into Syria, and shalt serve Egypt. And then it goes back and forth explaining then the relationship of these countries related with these roots. A chapter earlier was explained in the coming back of the tabernacling. And then you have sections of the other chapter then explaining on that day, explaining of what is coming then as far as the Alum feast, because it says in that day, and shalt be a highway. So then the 23rd verse explains, and he shalt hear them, and shalt heal them, in that day shalt be a highway out of Egypt into Syria, and the regions that we are then explaining as the very birthplace of the Ishmaelites. That's why Egypt is so important. Egypt is so important that the Creator himself, because of the situation that went on, decided to give a half of his anointing given to humans via the relationship of Hagar and then Ibrahim. From this relationship then you can understand very precisely then these very important roots returning. And China is truly leading towards this point. Though they don't have holy instructions of their own, the Chinese are very wise regarding trade. So then, how do we respond to this time of reparation or then restoration or repair of the holy instructions? How do the nations of the West respond? Because mostly of the West, they're absolutely blind of this very important fact. They have a tendency of making this period eternal, when truly isn't. New ways of doing trade via the net are then available nearly every day. How nations should respond. The President of China, Mr. Xi, many times, as he visited the nations, his plan is for infrastructuring. And most often than not, he explains the ports where ships, there they dock, and they load and they leave, and then airports, roads, and then aircrafts. You then explain to others regarding then trains, transportation, logistics. Why he is so insistent regarding these topics? It's because he knows there is a new system coming. As nations are not prepared, because when it becomes available on the net, people simply download, and then they want to have their parcels, they want to have their boxes, they want to have their shipments. And as they purchase from China these items, they want to have their items, and then it's going to get stuck there in the port. And then governments are going to try to hold it because they want to charge a tax, because they want to investigate. They won't have time for this anymore. There's going to be 10, 20, 30 ships awaiting for unloading, and they won't have the privilege of playing around with boxes anymore. Understandably, the friends of China, they are very aware of this fact. The entire Asia is in a new pace of trade, and the West is simply stagnated in this understanding of logistics, and stagnated in the way they think. They are those kinds of people, yet mostly they want to print the money and hide under the pad. They can't do this anymore. So then, what else can we understand of China? As China and the European Union are the most important places of trade of this planet, China has then its largest trader is then the European Union, and vice versa. United States became the third. As of a couple of days ago, the United States is the third in the world. About 6 months ago, a year ago or so, the United States was the first, then became the second, and yesterday and the day before it became the third. So the ways of thinking of the West is then antiquated. That's why we should be seriously invest in our airports and ports and transportation and trains and roads, because the time for prosperity is coming. Then how should we respond? Now, each person had a way of understanding in a certain way, in a certain fashion, in a certain type of understanding. But the holy instructions are saying, they are very precisely and warning us ahead of time, there is a time of prosperity coming. So then the prophecies of Daniel, the 12th chapter, of the high knowledge mixed with the trade, then is in practice. These then should give us more time to evaluate what's going on and then make the proper changes. Next time we're going to evaluate these and more regarding then the autumn feast, because there are lots of layers related with trade and Galah. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.